Hello, everyone. So, this week we're going to start off talking about the economics of platforms. Just to give you an idea of where we're going, we're going to start by kind of defining what a platform is, talk about how platforms kind of fit into classic ideas of economic competition and some of the problems that arise there. Then we're going to focus particularly on labor platforms and kind of what some of the consequences for labor are. And finally, I'm going to wrap it up by talking about what do platforms do. This is kind of maybe venturing, that last point probably ventures a little bit into history of thought territory, but I think it's really relevant. But anyway, let's start with defining platforms. So, the way to really think about platforms is they're just a type of firm like any other firm, but the value of their output increases as more people participate in the platform. So you could think about a classic example being Facebook, right? Like, it's really hard for a firm to move into what Facebook is doing because there's already so many people on the Facebook platform and nobody's on the new platform. Like, that's why Google Plus failed, for instance, right? Is like they may have had an equally good or even superior platform in kind of the nuts and bolts of it, but they just didn't have the participants. So the value of whatever the platform provides increases as more people participate. These are typically going to be services. There are some goods-based platforms, but the largest ones are going to be service-based. So think Amazon Mechanical Turk, Uber, even Airbnb. These sorts of kind of platforms are providing services and not goods. As far as goods-based platforms, you could think about, at least in its earlier kind of life, Amazon or eBay as being goods-based platforms. So platforms aren't really new. We think of the platform model as being new, but what we're really seeing is a difference in scale and intensity, and that's kind of been enabled by technology. We could also think about like railroads, telephones, and mail delivery networks as being older forms of a platform-based business model. And as we all know, these kind of businesses that generate large positive network effects, this kind of increasing value with output, we did a huge amount of regulating on them back in the 18 and 1900s, right? We heavily regulated the railroads. We kind of set up artificial competition across the country, but that's a story for another day. Telephones was an enormous monopoly because it is the efficient scale of production to provide telephone services, but it was heavily regulated monopoly. So just kind of keep that in the back of your mind as we talk about platforms. So, moving on to the Cernic reading, platforms connect buyers and sellers together. And they do this through unprecedented centralization of data. So they know a lot more about the things that people are buying. There's tons of things on the internet that are apparently free, but if it looks free, you're really selling something without knowing it. So, for instance, Google in its earlier days, whenever it was mostly, I think it still is mostly an ad company, it's selling people's eyeballs to people who want advertising. And so, even though it's free, you're kind of selling something without noticing it. That's not to say you don't get something of value oftentimes for this, right? Like, without the ad-based model, you couldn't get YouTube or Facebook, and these are things that people like and derive utility from. But let's kind of think about how these things spiral a bit. So a platform, at least these modern contemporary platforms, typically begin in some core business model that generates a lot of data. Amazon with book selling, Google with search engine and ad sales. And so this is where they begin. And then eventually they start expanding, not in terms of vertical integration like a railroad would, right? Or a steel producer would, but they start expanding into adjacent industries that also generate lots of data. So this is how you get the weird things where there's a new startup and they are making smart doorbells and then Google buys them right away, right? Is because that security platform or that doorbell platform creates a lot of data that Google can then use to enhance the value of its core as well as its peripheral businesses. Also end up with kind of silly things like why Facebook purchased a VR headset company, right? So these are all things that are not within their kind of normal business purview, but enhance their ability to collect data, which lets them match buyers and sellers together more quickly, more efficiently, or more in more opportunities than they otherwise could. So really, they're not competing on price, they're not competing on quantity, they're competing in this other kind of less on the surface of it economic realm of data. So we've got these firms, they're collecting data because this helps generate these large positive network effects. But large positive network effects make markets winner take all. You can't have this kind of perpetual prize fight of competition. There's going to be a winner for the most part. Somebody's going to have market power. Like you can't have a competitive market for social media sites that are all doing the same thing in kind of the conventional sense. So the only ways that kind of new entrants get into being social media sites is they do adjacent or different things. Like, Instagram is a very different platform than Facebook, is a very different platform than Twitter, but they're all social media websites doing different things. Also, coincidentally, like there's a lot of purchasing of these by kind of Facebook owns just tons and tons of these sites. So it's doing this because in order to be successful, its entire business plan is to establish market power. The platforms sometimes enable activities that otherwise wouldn't happen, but sometimes they allow activities to happen that wouldn't have happened otherwise. So, some examples. Uber allows kind of the market for rides to function much more efficiently than it did, say, under the taxi companies, where there were many other taxi companies that did a less efficient job of matching riders to drivers. And so a huge number of more of these transactions take place than did under the old model. Meanwhile, there are things like Amazon Mechanical Turk, where some tasks that would have never occurred anyway are now enabled by the platform. But whatever the case may be, the platform kind of gets to stand in the middle and extract value. And that's not to say that the platform contributes nothing, because like we said, it serves this role in kind of facilitating more transactions, but it also can increase the quality of output. Like, notwithstanding very prominent controversies, an Uber ride is a much more pleasurable experience than a taxi ride oftentimes is. So the quality of output can also be changed by the existence of the platform, though that's not inevitable. So we got this idea of platforms kind of standing in the middle. But one way that they're often able to kind of provide better services or apparently more efficient services isn't necessarily because they're operating at lower cost or more efficiently than the old model. Platforms are heavily dependent upon operating at a loss. So you'll have, say, Google cross-subsidizing Google Plus for years and years and years until it makes a profit. Now they gambled wrong there. Or you may have venture capital. For instance, Uber and Lyft largely subsist upon venture capital, and I think Uber only became profitable a year or two ago, and only in some markets. So the venture capitalists are actually kind of banking on the fact that Uber is going to sell below cost. They're going to basically pay their drivers more in not wages, but they're going to compensate their drivers more than they're making in revenue in order to establish a monopoly, and then they're going to jack up the price, and the venture capitalists will experience a return on their investment. So the monopoly isn't kind of a side effect. It's the goal of the entire business model, or it has to be. You do end up with kind of anomalies, right? Where, for instance, you've got Uber and Lyft that are in the same exact market, and what you kind of see is that they subspecialize. Like, Uber is by far the market leader. They're the price leader. They have market power. But Lyft is there, and Lyft's kind of distinguishing characteristic is that it compensates drivers more than Uber does. And so you've got this thing where you've kind of got a two-sided platform where a platform has to appeal both to customers and to drivers. Uber's strategy is to appeal more to customers. Lyft's strategy is to appeal more to drivers. But still, Uber does, I believe, over 85 or 90% of the rides in most markets where both services are present. So they're by far like a market leader. That segues nicely into the issues of labor, because Uber makes up kind of like the largest chunk of gig economy workers. And this ties in nicely with what we talked about last week with the platform, or with the fissured workplace. So gig economy workers oftentimes are doing things that are much like a normal job, but they lack the protections of a normal job, and it's difficult to regulate. And so that's the issues we're going to dig into right now. So a platform worker bears more risk than a traditional employee, but oftentimes lacks the benefits of being a truly independent contractor. For instance, Uber gets to dictate a lot of things about the quality of service, and the way that they kind of enforce that is the possibility of delistment. So, for instance, if a driver doesn't take optimal routes and customers complain, then the driver's rating will suffer and they might get delisted from the platform. And this isn't necessarily the same sort of circumstance that a true independent contractor would be in. And so, once again, monopoly rears its head. The fact that Uber has this huge market share means that delistment kind of has a bite. There isn't an alternative for the driver to continue to do what they're doing if they're delisted. So, one way that we can think about this whole kind of gig economy arrangement is that it's regulatory evasion. It's a deregulated fringe that firms kind of flee to reduce labor costs, just like they would offshore jobs. But it's important to note, if we're going to kind of go into political economy for a second here, that this isn't kind of happening in a fixed set of rules. Uber and other very powerful platforms do spend an immense amount of time, money, and effort lobbying to get a preferential legal framework. They change the rules of quote-unquote employment to benefit them. In this diagram here, you can see that I've kind of got like a labor market and output market, and there's kind of this nice circle between on-demand work and on-demand labor that the platforms and workers benefit from, right? Like, workers like having the ability to set their own schedule. So normally, if a platform or firm has a high degree of market power, you would expect antitrust legislation to get involved, or antitrust enforcement to get involved. But antitrust is, for very, kind of historical and political reasons, has kind of been broken since the 90s. No large, successful antitrust suit has really been successfully pursued in a very long time. So Uber is able to increase their influence on regulation, increase their market share, and there's no kind of countervailing force to push back against that because antitrust is broken. On the other side of this diagram, we've got collective action. And so because Uber drivers and other gig economy workers are not considered employees, they lack a lot of the rights of employees, right? So they're not allowed to form unions or collectively organize because that would be considered a collusion and restraint of trade. And so that link is broken. And so essentially, platforms are able to continually tilt the political balance in their favor. All right. So, workers kind of get rolled over by this cycle. But let's talk about what exactly we mean by gig work, right? So, in the second reading I had you read, they identify 5 qualities of gig work. The irregular schedules driven by demand for output, worker-provided capital, worker-provided place of work, piece rate compensation, and then kind of the new part of this is digital mediation, because in earlier stages of capitalism, all 4 of the previous points were kind of present in labor contracts. So that's the common qualities of gig work, but we can kind of define gig work platforms into 2 types. There's crowd work systems, where it's kind of more of a bidding in completing work. So the platform really is not involved much more than linking buyers and sellers and maybe vetting vendors on the site, but it doesn't do a lot of day-to-day directing of work. Examples here we can think of, say, TaskRabbit or many of the sites where independent contractors who do graphic design, web design, or programming work are able to kind of go. The other system is work-on-demand systems, and this is kind of the much more familiar thing. Uber, perhaps even Amazon Mechanical Turk. But in this realm, it's most often kind of real-world work that can't be delivered through the internet, and the platforms maintain a lot of control over important aspects of the work, right? So Uber tells the driver the exact route to take. Crowdworks function more kind of like intermediaries that all platforms claim to be. Meanwhile, work-on-demand platforms look a lot more like employers or traditional firms. Just to put it in perspective, in the U.S., between 0.5% and 4% of the U.S. workforce is engaged in some sort of gig work. It varies by definition. It's kind of tough to hone in on an exact number based on well, does somebody count as a gig worker if they did, 1 day of gig work in a year, or do we look at the last month? So there's kind of upper and lower bounds there. I believe the 0.5 came from defining it as having done gig work in the last week, and the 4% came from having done it within the last year. There's kind of like a power law going on here. Most people that do gig work only do a very small amount of it, and they usually only do it temporarily. And so this is about, in most studies, 80% of the people that are doing gig work. But many fewer, anywhere from 10 to 20%, are doing kind of full-time, long-term amounts of work. So that's kind of the way it divides up. So, talking about the worker more specifically, we can think about this kind of not really an independent contractor, not really an employee model, as shifting risk onto the worker and sometimes onto the end user. So, for instance, if you get, if a Airbnb owner has their place trashed, then they're liable for that. Or if you rent an Airbnb and it's terrible, then you're kind of stuck with that. And so it's shifting all this risk onto these contracting parties without taking on very much of the risk themselves as the platform. So there really is kind of mostly this link from kind of worker owner to the intermediary to the end user. And there could be a link between the worker and end user, but this is often not explicitly defined in contract and is usually absent. So, existing labor laws and labor regulations don't really deal well with this kind of not really a contractor, not really an employee entity that is most gig workers. And so there's a few options that Stanford and Stewart put forward for kind of dealing with this regulatory gap. One is to confirm and enforce existing regulation, let the reach of existing labor regulations slowly expand through litigation, right? So not really change much of anything and just see how it all shakes out in the courts. We could also clarify and expand definitions of employment. So this would be redefining employment to include gig workers. We could also just create an entirely new category of independent worker. This is a proposal that has come forward a lot in the U.S., but has not really gained much traction. And then the last two are somewhat more radical. They propose creating rights for workers, not employees. So workers would have rights independent of whether they are employers or contractors, or employees or contractors, or what have you. Or finally, we could reconsider the concept of an employer, so that people could have joint employers for different purposes. So, like, perhaps if somebody works for McDonald's, for some purposes, the franchise might be their employer, and for other purposes, McDonald's might be their employer. And so this is one of those ideas of kind of refining and changing the concept of what an employer is. I'm not sure what the way forward would be. Stewart and Stanford kind of put forward this idea that we should kind of use a bit of everything. But I do have some reservations, particularly about creating a new category of independent worker. But you can leave that up to you to think about how that could be potentially problematic. So I just wanted to wrap up here by talking about this this idea of what platforms do. We've already talked about how kind of they stand in the middle, they facilitate transactions, and both of those stories are true to some extent. But in the kind of classics of economics literature, there's kind of two really good stories that fit nicely onto the platform. Coase talks about why firms exist, kind of this broader concept, right? And so a firm exists to minimize transaction costs because accessing the market is costly, making contracts for everything you want to do is costly, so you bring things in administratively and do things hierarchically without having to, deal with all of these costs of writing contracts, of finding out prices, of monitoring people that you're contracting with. So, firms exist to minimize transaction costs, and this story fits really nicely for platforms, right? Like, it makes it easier to get a ride to the airport, and so Uber is doing a good job in that story. We get kind of like the mirror universe version of this story with Margolin. He was kind of hitting on the same idea from a different perspective whenever he was talking about, well, what do bosses do? And for Margolin, the role of the boss is to create an artificial role in production that allows the owner, boss, capitalist, whatever, it's kind of mixed concepts here. But whoever is benefiting from this process to create an artificial position for themselves that allows them to extract the maximum surplus. And in doing this, they also alter the technology of production, not to maximize output or maximize profit or maximize benefit to everyone in the productive process, but to maximize their own individual profit. And so this makes sense of why, like, some platforms maybe are acting in a more boss capacity. Maybe it's these more, less these crowd work platforms and more these work on demand systems that are behaving more like Marglin's vision. And maybe the crowd work systems are behaving more in this kind of coast transaction cost minimizing vision. Both stories are always going to be true to some extent, but they're both frameworks that we can use to think about these things. So, just wrapping things up, platforms are dependent upon data, and they use this data to win competition, and so that's how they're successful. So a platform is really kind of antithetical to perfect competition. Platforms stand in the middle of buyers and sellers of whatever that may be. It could be attention, it could be rides, it could be very minuscule tasks. One of my favorite examples of this is there was an app that was developed that you would take a picture of a plate of food and it would spit out relatively accurate caloric information about that plate of food. And it was like, oh, we've got this great kind of AI model that's doing this. No. What they were doing is they were hiring people on Amazon Mechanical Turk to estimate this with like a set of instructions. And so it's kind of even hiding the fact that a human is doing it. So anyway, it's kind of interesting, the weird oddities you end up in this kind of gig economy world. Anyway, labor platforms allow for labor regulation, evasion, and reduce labor costs. And they're just kind of one small part of what we talked about last week, which is this bigger idea of the fissured workplace, which some estimates say is up to 20% of the labor force in the U.S. And finally, labor standards are difficult to enforce when it comes to labor platforms because it's really not clear what the legal status of these people are. As far as kind of, are they employees, are they independent contractors, and we're still kind of waiting till that gets sorted out in the courts in the U.S. There have been some recent cases in California about this where the legislature actually passed a law saying that Uber and Lyft drivers were employees, and they just continue to treat them all as independent contractors and are seeing if they can win the court case. And if they are ruled to be employees, this essentially destroys that business model in that state. So, these platforms have a lot of skin in the game when it comes to labor regulation, and so of course they spend a lot of resources on trying to influence how that policy process evolves. Meanwhile, workers are legally prohibited from even trying, right? So, paints a bleak picture for labor, but there's maybe some hope on the horizon that it all gets sorted out soon. All right, that's all I got.